Greetings, this is Phil McMichael from Ithaca, New York, and I'm going to give you a brief overview of the current food regime and the kind of restructuring that it's undergoing at the present time. The concept of the food regime refers to the political structuring of food provisioning across national borders for strategic purposes, whether by dominant states and or financial interests. In this particular period of time, from the 1980s to the 2000s, the so-called neoliberal or corporate food regime was a politically structured division of agricultural labor across the world. And this is not about all the food that's being produced in the world. This is about the food trade, which has such an impact on these other local food systems. But this division of agricultural labor was a division between the global north, that is the European Union and the United States in particular, selling grains on the world market in return for high-value food products being produced in the global south, such as fruits and vegetables all year round, and meats and fish. Now, the origins of this political structuring are important to lay out very briefly. Firstly, in the 1980s, because of the debt regime, countries in the global south were told that they had to expand their agro-exports in order to pay off their debts. And so non-traditional foodstuffs, fruits and vegetables in particular, became an important part of this trade from the global south. And this was matched in the 1990s with the WTO free trade rules that pushed open the economies of the global south with liberalization, allowing them to import more and more surplus foodstuffs being marketed by the global north. Meanwhile, the global north was protecting its own farm subsidies within the WTO structure. So we had an institutionalized food order during this period that was highly asymmetrical and in a sense was an operation of managed food dumping in the markets of the global south and access to high-value foods for relatively affluent consumers largely in the global north, but in some areas of the global south at the same time. Peter Rossett has referred to this period as a cheap food regime because, in fact, the artificially cheapened grains that the north was dumping in the global south markets pushed food prices across the world down during the 1990s to their lowest point in 150 years. And this, of course, deepened the agrarian crisis in the global south and also in parts of the global north, leading to large-scale dispossession of small farmers. The FAO calculated upwards of 30 million small farmers were dispossessed or displaced during this particular decade as a consequence of the global food regime. At the same time, because of the agrarian crisis that this was deepening, the food sovereignty movement emerged in the early 1990s, and it essentially politicized what the powers that be, the development agencies and the political economic elites were calling a food security system that the WTO had instituted. The food security, they argued, the food sovereignty movement argued, the food security system was a food security system for rich consumers. It wasn't meeting the needs of the majority of the global poor, and it was certainly compromising the ability of national governments to manage their own food systems, to supply food for their own citizens, and to encourage and support small farmers and small producers in general on the land, in the forests, etc., in the fisher regions. So this kind of challenge that came from the food sovereignty movement represented, I think, a very important thread that is still here with us and growing stronger today because it's beginning to take on a new currency across the world, this concept of food sovereignty. But it referred essentially to the rights of small producers, and the critique was that the development narrative assumed that small producers were a historical relic, when in fact we know that recent scientific consensus suggests that small producers in diverse agricultures, in fact, are not only producing as much, if not more, food as monocultures, but they also are regenerative and restorative of the land and water cycles, and good for the environment, and of course good for the rights of small producers to stay on the land. The 2000s crisis that emerged, and the crisis that emerged during the 2000s, I think, was multifaceted. Of course, it included climate, financial, energy, and food crisis, but also the crisis of the WTO. The WTO was stalemated by the G20, making the point that northern hypocrisy in the conduct of the so-called free trade system was unfair, and so the WTO has essentially been at a standstill for the last few years. And at the same time, we've also seen the so-called food crisis draw much more attention to the condition of agriculture across the world, in particular the plight of smallholders. And this became very clear in 2008 with the publication of two reports. As we know, the World Development Report, in which the World Bank finally focused on agriculture after 25 years of neglect, and the ISTAD report that came out that challenged the industrial agricultural model. Now, each of these reports had a particular understanding of what it means to improve smallholder agriculture. The World Bank's report argued that improvement would come from increased agro inputs and the elaboration of value chains to bring them into contact with world markets, essentially an agribusiness model. The ISTAD report, of course, talked about revaluing farmer knowledge and promoting farmer rights and agroecology as a combination of traditional and ecological science. So this was an important turning point, I think, and ratcheting up, if you like, of the politics of the food system, and it was an indication, I think, that the corporate food regime was beginning to unravel. Its unraveling has been intensified by the land grab that has followed the food crisis in 2008. And the land grab has a number of different aspects to it that I just want to outline, perhaps to give you some structure for your discussions. The land grab, I think, suggests that the granaries of the north are beginning to be displaced by increasingly multi-centric southern-based food circuits, as more and more land is being grabbed, some of it being put into production, and so food circuits are going south-south more rather than simply north-south, and of course they're going south-north too. Secondly, the sovereign wealth funds that are directly annexing land offshore, coming in particular from the Middle East and from countries like China and Korea. This is a new agro-security mercantilism, in my view. It eliminates market intermediation and, of course, overrides the WTO free trade system via non-trade-based food delivery from offshore sites. At the same time, there's a proliferation of soft or informal governance mechanisms complemented with World Bank-initiated infrastructure for deepening the privatization of land use and the privatization of states for local and foreign investors, to encourage local and foreign investors. Land grab governance is now in the name of improving so-called unused lands and addressing the so-called yield gap. And this is being challenged very strongly from below by the various movements, by the deliberations in the FAO around the Committee on Food Security and the elaboration of the voluntary guidelines emphasizing the rights of customary tenure and the rights of women, and then Olivier de Schutter's very pungent concept of the RAI responsibly destroying the world's peasantry. Part of this whole process is the process of enclosure of lands, which formerly the corporate food regime displaced people by trade, and now people are being displaced by enclosure, leading to a huge social reproduction crisis, and this is exacerbated by individual land titling and land markets. The World Bank acknowledged their negative impact on women and communal rights. Financialization is part of this story, where investors don't really care whether it's food, feed, fuel, or bioproducts that are being produced on the land, so long as they turn a profit. So agriculture is being reduced and fetishized. And finally, I would argue that the food regime itself is transitioning from the managed subsidized surpluses to a food deficit regime for the future, um, insofar as land grabbing continues unregulated, and price inflation, of course, will continue with financial speculation and rising energy costs. So this is the kind of scenario that I think we face, where the political ordering of the global food system is in some kind of crisis and transition, and it's very important that the principles of food sovereignty begin to define how we address these changes. Thank you very much.